Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is The Silence of the Lambs. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of The Silence of the Lambs with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. The Silence of the Lambs is a 1988 psychological horror novel written by Thomas Harris and made famous by the 1991 film starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins as the unforgettable Hannibal Lecter. The Silence of the Lambs is a second novel in the Hannibal series, the first one being Red Dragon and then followed by Hannibal. There isn't much information available about Thomas Harris, probably due to his extremely private and secluded lifestyle. He was born and raised in Tennessee and Mississippi, and he projects somewhat an image of a Southern gentleman, a bit of the Kentucky Fried Chicken's Colonel Sanders, or even Hannibal Lecter without the psycho side. People who know Harris consider him the nicest person you will ever meet, but Lecter was pretty nice too if you didn't get on his bad side. People who write this kind of novels make one wonder about their psychology and where they get the ideas from. The other two novels Harris wrote, besides the four in the Hannibal Lecter series, also deal with violence and the dark side of humanity. So maybe it is his curiosity about the other side and the paths not taken. If you are interested in Harris, there is the 2019 interview he did for a TV station in Long Island, where he talks about his life and books, which I found to be very good, and it is available on YouTube. What is The Silence of the Lambs about? It is about the dynamic of power and manipulation and the psychological traumas of childhood. It presents the violent and dangerous side of life, usually closer to us than we think, because it is not very visible, hidden and masked under the superficiality of the daily, socially acceptable behavior. He lives down in a ribcage, in the dry leaves of a heart. And the moment of silence, of loneliness in each one of us makes us see it. There's also the primal hunter instinct present in many of us to varying degrees. The bad guys hunt for their victims, and the good guys hunt for them, their victims. Problem solving is hunting. It is savage pleasure, and we are born to it. And in the book, the top hunter is Hannibal Lecter. A bit of the plot. At the beginning, Harris discloses how he got the idea for Hannibal Lecter. While visiting an American prisoner in Mexico, he was introduced to a perfectly behaving doctor, helpful and pleasant, and they discussed the American's life, childhood, etc., and what might have led him to commit his crimes. And later, Harris found out that the doctor himself was an insane killer locked up in the prison. The story starts with an FBI cadet, Clarice Sterling, being given an assignment to scrutinize the FBI psychological profile of the serial killers. And her subject is Dr. Hannibal Lecter, locked up in a maximum security mental institution in Baltimore for killing various individuals and consuming parts of their bodies. But the hidden motive for Sterling's visit is to see if Lecter could be helpful in catching the current active serial killer, nicknamed Buffalo Bill, because of his habit of skinning his victims. Lecter sees an opportunity to better the conditions of his confinement and agrees, in exchange for favors, including a bit of a dessert for his own ego, Sterling's confessions about her own troubled childhood. When Senator's daughter is kidnapped, pressure on the FBI mounts to apprehend Buffalo Bill, and Lecter can sense it and plays hard with the information he can offer. Clarice, I am going to tell you what Buffalo Bill wants Catherine Baker Martin for, and then good night. This is my last word under the current terms. You can tell the senator what he wants with Catherine, and she can come up with a more interesting offer for me. And there also arises an opportunity for him to regain his freedom, which he doesn't waste. Meanwhile, Starling manages to unscramble and stitch together the bits of information received from Lecter, and it allows her to create her own opportunity to catch Buffalo Bill. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about the Silence of the Lambs? It is probably as good as the crime psychological thriller gets, but the book is not as much about crime as it is a deep character exploration. The one that is most analyzed is not Buffalo Bill or Hannibal Lecter and their dark and violent personalities. It is Clarice Starling, who on the surface is your normal young woman trying to protect and serve. But there are rather complex personal motives that push her to wanting to become an FBI agent. The legacy of her father and his violent death, also her painful and difficult childhood. Besides losing her father and being sent to an orphanage, she was also exposed to more violence and suffering by witnessing the slaughter of innocent animals. All these experiences left a deep mark on her and made her realize that the world is a brutal and violent place where the innocent need to be protected. And all these deeply buried traumas and reasons are skillfully brought to the surface by Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Far beneath the rusty Baltimore dawn, steering in the maximum security ward, down where it is never dark, the tormented sands beginning day as oysters in a barrel open to their lost tide. God's creatures who cried themselves to sleep stirred to cry again, and the ravers cleared their throats. The exchange of deeply personal information between the two, more so coming from Starling, created trust and deep intimacy without sex. Hannibal, being a highly skilled psychiatrist, turned Starling into somewhat of his patient, even though it was her who was supposed to be in control and do all the questioning. And as the plot progresses and Lecter works his magic, she slowly, bit by bit, reveals to the reader, and more importantly herself, the whys of her actions and ultimately who she is. Well, Clarice, have the lambs stopped screaming? I won't be surprised if the answer is yes and no. The lambs will stop for now. But Clarice, you judge yourself with all the mercy of the dungeon scales at Thrift. You will have to earn it again and again, the blessed silence. Because it's the plight that drives you, seeing the plight, and the plight will not end, ever. I think the memories of her father, maybe not who he was, but who she thought he was, is one of the main driving forces behind her actions. She idealized him, and then he died while protecting and serving, and perhaps by becoming a police officer herself, she maintains part of him alive and present in her life. And suddenly her father's voice, speaking to her with his hand on her brother's shoulder. If you can't play without scolding, Clarice, go on to the house. Lecter asks her what is her worst memory, and she responds, the death of her father. But there is also the remembering of the slaughter of the innocent animals and hearing their cries, which seem to some extent subconscious. And this might be the principal drive in her to catch Buffalo Bill, with hope that the saving of the lives of his future victims will put a stop to hear the crying of the lambs in her own head once and for all. Starling, in some sense, is a savior who needs victims to save, and there is no better place to find victims than being a police officer. In one specific situation, she thinks if she dies, so will the current victim, being prepared by Buffalo Bill for slaughter, and she cannot let this happen, and it drives her to make sure she stays alive, so the girl stays alive as well. And the talk of father figures leads to the Jack Crawford character. Actually, Starling seems to deal with three father figures: her biological dead father, and to a certain extent Hannibal Lecter and Jack Crawford. Jack Crawford is a good guy, keeping everybody safe, a Boy Scout. He takes care of his dying wife by giving her injections, which he practiced on his own leg. Starling sees him as somewhat of a father figure, giving her practical advice on how to stay on the right track and trying to protect her. Here's some free advice. Use Senator Martin. Let her tell you how grateful she is. Let her hand you the markers. Do it soon. Gratitude has a short half-life. You will need her one of these days, the way you act. Crawford reminds Starling of her own father, who she lost, and maybe even thinks he could fill that role. He appears in the other two novels, but it is in The Silence of the Lambs that he is most profoundly explored. Crawford maintains a cold and distant relation with Lecter because of what the latter did to his friend in the previous novel, Red Dragon. He refuses and never meets face-to-face with Lecter, and this leaves Lecter somewhat frustrated. I've read the cases, Clarice, have you? Everything you need to know to find him is right there, if you are paying attention. Even Inspector Emeritus Crawford should have figured it out. Incidentally, did you read Crawford's stupefying speech last year to the National Police Academy, spouting Marcus Aurelius on duty and honor and fortitude? We'll see what kind of a stoic Crawford is when Bella bites the big one. He copies his philosophy out of Bartlett's Familiar, I think. If he understood Marcus Aurelius, he might solve his case. Crawford's reaction hit directly at Lecter's ego and undermined the power he feels over others. He was able to convince one of the inmates in the asylum who insulted Starling to commit suicide by swallowing his own tongue. So Lecter feels quite confident about his people skills, but he can't get to Crawford, and deals with him differently. He is patronizing, even dismissive when talking to others, but in the personal note he writes to Crawford, he appears to treat him with respect, even as his equal. The most fascinating character in the book is Dr. Hannibal Lecter, who is somewhat of a bystander and observer, so he is the one who analyzes instead of being analyzed, and this gives him an aura of mystery. Not coincidentally, he is a psychiatrist, fitting perfectly with what he does. Lecter considers himself a predator, being at the top of the feeding chain, and he seems to be repulsed by the society's idea that he might be a victim of circumstances. Nothing happened to me, Officer Starling. I happened. You can't reduce me to a set of influences. You've given up good and evil for behaviorism, Officer Starling. You've got everybody in moral dignity pants. Nothing is ever anybody's fault. Look at me, Officer Starling. Can you stand to say I am evil? Am I evil, Officer Starling? Hannibal Lecter is, for most readers, the favorite character, and that's why Harris made him the protagonist of the following novels. He is your perfect psychopath, much more interesting than the American Psycho I read recently. He is so cold and calculated, seemingly always in control, and never forgetting his good manners even when killing. Apparently being void or completely disconnected from his emotions, but there are glimpses of some deeply buried traumatic feelings, and all his doings might be to satisfy them and at the same time to keep them under lock, invisible. I think the fourth novel in the series, Hannibal Rising, tries to give more emotional dimension to Lecter, and how his early experiences influenced or even created the latter psycho. The highlight of The Silence of the Lambs is his relationship with Starling. They can be considered adversaries, but he likes and even protects her. I have no plans to call on you, Clarice, the world being more interesting with you in it. Be sure you extend me the same courtesy. Referring to the father figure, where Crawford is a practical teacher and tries to teach Starling how to live externally, Hannibal shows her who she is and what motivates her, so she can find some internal peace. James Gump, aka Buffalo Bill, the name that Lecter disapproves because it mislabels Gump's motives for the killings. During autopsy, they realize the victims are killed before being mutilated, which shows he's a practical man with a purpose, not somebody who simply kills women for the sake of killing them. I don't think Gump is explored in the depth comparable to the other characters. There is some superficial analysis and in the end a bit of childhood biography. This might be intentional since throughout the whole novel they all, with the exception of Lecter, have little knowledge about the personality, workings and motives of James Gump. So his somewhat superficial portrayal gives him some dark mystery and makes him into a human puzzle to be put together. What does he do, Clarice? What is the first and principal thing he does? What needs does he serve by killing? He covets. How do we begin to covet? We begin by coveting what we see every day. But the importance of Gump is being the ingredient or even the glue that brings and maintains the main characters together and creates a deep relationship between them that goes beyond him and the crime. Gump seems to be there just as a situation creator to draw out the personalities of the other characters. To sum it up, The Silence of the Lambs is a beautifully written crime story made great by the deeply explored characters. The prose at times is sensual and poetic, and it makes you forget you are reading a crime thriller. But the face on the pillow, rosy in the firelight, is certainly that of Clarice Starling, and she sleeps deeply, sweetly in The Silence of the Lambs. On the surface, the book tries to portray evil as an absolute condition. There might be some influences from experiences, especially childhood, but they are just an addition, maybe even a trigger to the already existing predisposition to do bad things. But in the end, the novel seems to imply that all is based on self-interpretation that lead to the decisions and action one takes. The exact same experience can be interpreted in two extremely different ways by two different people. Starling is portrayed as the product of her childhood and circumstances, its interpretation a force for good, so perhaps it is the denial of the power of the circumstances on our lives that creates evil, at least some of it. Probably it is a lot more complex than that, and it works both ways. There is the famous adaptation of The Silence of the Lambs with Jodie Foster as Starling and the unforgettable performance by Anthony Hopkins playing Dr. Hannibal Lecter. I think anybody who has seen the movie will always see Hopkins as Lecter when reading the novel. The film is between the best book adaptations ever made. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback which I transformed into hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A, naturally tan hide I buy from Tanner in North Spain. The same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First I designed the cover, which what I did here. I adapted this painting of a young woman looking as she is asleep, but in reality dead, her body prepared for her final purpose to make somebody else more beautiful in his own eyes. And there is the butterfly, which symbolizes Buffalo Bill and his struggle. This is the back with the blurb, and inside front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel. And for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze, or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.